Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's Talim lecture, organized by the UK Talim Department. We'll begin with the recitation of the Holy Quran. If I could please request Labid Sharwani Sahib to cite the portion.
Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زيجت وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت وإذا الصحف نشرت وإذا السماء كشطت. Translation. In the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful. And when the sun is wrapped up, and when the stars are obscured, and when the mountains are made to move, and when the she-camels 10-month pregnant are abandoned, and when the beasts are gathered together, and when the seas are made to flow forth one into the other, and when people are brought together, and when the girl child buried alive is questioned about, for what crime was she killed? And when books are spread abroad, and when the heaven is laid bare. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah. Tonight we have the pleasure of being joined by Qaasid Muin Ahmad Sahib. Qaasid Sahib is going to be speaking tonight on the topic of Al-Hakam, preserving the history of the Jama'at. He is a Waqf-e-Nau, born and raised in the United Kingdom. He was admitted to Jamia in 2006 and graduated from Jamia Ahmadiyya in 2013. Before his official posting, he spent time in Ghana, South Spain, and Rabah for training, and was assigned duties in MTA's programming department in 2014, and was assigned duties as editor of Al-Hakam in early 2018. Viewers, as always, will have a chance to put questions to our respected speaker this evening. Please do so using the chat facility and kindly ensure that the questions are relevant to tonight's topic. It gives me great pleasure indeed to ask Qaasid Muin Sahib to deliver tonight's lecture.
Jazakumullah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. As you all will know, I am going to speak to you about Al-Hakam and its role in preserving the history of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at. Now, most of you will know that Al-Hakam was recently launched in English by Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz, specifically on the 23rd of March, 2018. And Al-Hakam actually has a very rich history, and it has a very strong message for the world when you just speak only of Al-Hakam. And inshallah, I'll be mentioning some of that today, because of course, when we talk about Al-Hakam, we're talking about effectively the very early stages of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at, especially in the time of the promised Messiah. And this is something which I will allude to further. Al-Hakam, if we go back to the early time, so Al-Hakam, the name, at the moment we know about Al-Hakam in English, which I'm sure many of you will have seen. It's available as a website, www.alhakam.org. It's available as an app on iOS and Android devices, and it's also available in print. And in print, you may have seen something along the lines of this. So this is kind of what it looks like in print, and some of you may have subscribed as well already. This is the English version, but if we go back in history in the time of the Promised Messiah, Islam, we actually find that Al-Hakam was the very first newspaper of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat. And it wasn't just the very first newspaper, but in fact, it was the very first organ to actually connect members of the Jamaat to the Markaz. So it had a very central role in its very early stages. It was launched in 1897, 8th of October 1897 to be precise, by who was then a young companion, Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib. He also goes by the name of Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Turab, Razillahu Ta'ala anhu. And he at the time was, like I said, a very young companion. And he was a journalist at the Pesa Akhbar. And the Pesa Akhbar, we should remember, was not an ordinary newspaper at the time. It was a very prominent newspaper in northern India where Urdu was being spoken. Because of course, we have to remember India was a country where, various languages were being spoken. It was almost like a melting pot of various races. We had people in the north speaking Punjabi and Urdu, and in the south speaking various other languages. So the Pesa Akhbar was targeted as an Urdu. It was basically effectively an Urdu newspaper. And Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib, Razillahu Ta'ala anhu, was a journalist there. And he, obviously being a young man and a journalist, naturally he had lots of ambitions. And Hazrat Sheikh Sahib, when he obviously pledged allegiance to the Promised Messiah Islam, naturally he must have thought of what services he could offer to the Promised Messiah Islam, because at the time, like I said, there was no organ, there was nothing that was on behalf of the Markaz, on behalf of the center of the Jamaat going out there, apart from the books of the Promised Messiah, which were being published as and when the Promised Messiah would, complete a project. And we have so many, over 90 books that we see today in the form of Ruhani Khazain, which form the books of the Promised Messiah, alayhi salatu wassalam. So these were being published at the time, but these were obviously, one by one, they were individually being published. And as and when, sometimes there may be breaks of months, maybe a few years, but they weren't something regularly keeping the members of the Jamaat who were residing in various parts of India, various parts of Asia, or the world. They weren't being informed about the Markaz, they weren't being informed about what was happening in the center, in the life of the Promised Messiah, what he was doing, how his daily engagements were, what his daily engagements were. So Hazrat Sheikh Sahib, he wrote to the Promised Messiah with, being the young, aspiring, ambitious companion that he was. He wrote to him and said that I feel that, we need a newspaper. And we should, through this newspaper, this would be a great means of connecting the Jamaat. And through this newspaper, we can also have a platform through which we can express our views as Ahmadi Muslims. And, in doing so, effectively, what was happening was preparing Ansar Sultan al-Qalam, which is, the servants of Sultan al-Qalam, which means the prince of the pen, i.e. the Promised Messiah. So servants who would assist the Promised Messiah even further in terms of writing. And in the chapter that you just heard in the Tilawat, there is a verse where that's suhufu nushirat, that when the books are spread abroad, or when the pages are spread abroad, and this newspaper was just one of those. And that surah, that chapter, you must remember that those were the signs of the latter days. Those latter days were when the Promised Messiah and Imam Mahdi were destined to appear. We believe that to be Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And in his lifetime, alayhi salatu wassalam, in his lifetime, we see not only his books, but things like Al-Hakam effectively being published and then being spread and propagated throughout the world. Hazrat Sheikh Sahib wrote this letter to the Promised Messiah expressing his desire. The Promised Messiah alayhi salam replied that we do not have any experience in this field, nor do we. In fact, I can read out what the Promised Messiah alayhi salam said. This is stated in Hayat Ahmad, volume 4, pages 542 to 543. Hazrat Sheikh Sahib wrote to Hazur with the idea, and Hazrat Nasim alayhi salam said, we have no experience in this. We need a newspaper, but our Jamaat is an impoverished Jamaat. It cannot bear the financial constraints. if you can issue it based on your experience, i.e. if you can publish this newspaper based on your experience, you may do so. May Allah bless this endeavor. So we must remember that this was at a time when, you know, the companions were, there were very few. 1897, these are the early few years of the Jama'at. And this is at a time when the companions who were accepting the Promised Messiah, most of them, there were of course many prominent, you know, companions who were very well off, and you know, they did well in the world as well. Like Hazrat Sheikh Sahib, he was, you know, working at a decent post in the Pesa Akhbar, but most of the Jamaat were people were laborers, and they began to belonged to agriculturing, you know, jobs. So the Promised Messiah knew that it would be very difficult for everyone to be able to subscribe to this financially, and nor would the Jamaat collectively be able to bear this burden. But he entrusted this to the Promised Messiah by saying, may Allah bless this endeavor, knowing that Hazrat Sheikh Sahib would indeed take this on. And like I said, on the 8th of October 1897, Hazrat Sheikh Sahib then takes this upon himself. And since from that very period onwards, right up until the demise of the Promised Messiah, even beyond that, Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib then begins to publish this newspaper. Now, until the end of 1897, it was actually published in Amritsar, but later on, in the beginning of 1898, the publication actually moved to Qadian, and so it took essentially a central role while it was being published from Qadian. And from there, what is interesting to note is that Al-Hakam was not just a newspaper, just, you know, writing articles or including news of various Ahmadis around the world, but one of the most key roles it played, and one of the roles for which it will always be remembered, is that it not only recorded the words of the Promised Messiah, which he would say on various occasions. So we also should bear in mind that the Promised Messiah's custom was on a regular occasion, on a regular basis, what he would do is after Namaz-e-Asr or Maghrib, he would sit with his companions, perhaps in Masjid Mubarak or on the you know, roof of Masjid Mubarak. And of course, we have to take into account that the lifestyle there was very different to what we know it as today, bearing in mind the time and the location. So the Promised Messiah would sit with his companions, and sometimes, you know, a companion would mention something that, oh, today, you know, a colleague mentioned so-and-so fact, and I was wondering whether this is accurate. And he wouldn't even need to ask the Promised Messiah. The Promised Messiah would then, you know, begin effectively a speech on that very subject and expound beautifully on these on these facts and on these matters. This the presence of Al-Hakam played such a role, and Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib's journalistic capabilities played such a magnificent role that he was able to transcribe very quickly, you know, almost like shorthand, what the Promised Messiah Islam was saying. And because, like I said, you know, there was no MTA at the time that could record all this. There were no audio recorders that could, you know, continuously record everything the Promised Messiah Islam was saying. Hazrat Sheikh Sahib played that very role, and he would transcribe everything. So what we see today in the form of malfuzat is effectively a, you know, a gift that Hazrat Sheikh Sahib and Al-Hakam gave to the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat and us today. We sitting here, when we read malfuzat, it is you know, a gift that was given by Al-Hakam in those early days, and later on it would be also, you know, contributed towards by the Badr newspaper, but that came a bit later on. That was one aspect. Then what you also had were the revelations, the visions, and the dreams that the Promised Messiah would receive on a regular basis. And this, what would happen was, so people like Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib, who would later on become the pioneering missionary of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat in the United States of America. He played the role of almost, you know, the first private secretary. He would sit with the Promised Messiah Islam, opening letters and providing them to the Promised Messiah. And the Promised Messiah, if he ever needed him to convey a message to someone or write up a letter if it was too long, he would, you know, entrust that to Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib. And Hazrat Mufti Sahib was so close to the Promised Messiah, in fact, that he would actually sometimes stay in the same room as the Promised Messiah. So he was very fortunate in this respect. And I mention his name because he will also be, you know, he's a you know, a character that will come in the Al-Hakam story, you know, later on, and in the rich literature of the Muslim Jamaat later on, someone who appears even today on the pages of Al-Hakam. But I will come to that a bit later on. So Hazrat Mufti Sahib would be given revelations, dreams, and visions by the Promised Messiah to pass on to newspapers, and they would then publish them in their columns and mostly on the front pages. And so Al-Hakam played a role in publishing those revelations, dreams, and visions, and they would then become part of what is now Tazkira. We have to remember that Malfuzat and Tazkira were not necessarily compiled at the time of the Promised Messiah in his lifetime. And later on, these books, Tazkira and Malfuzat, would be compiled and collated as we know them and as we see them today. So Al-Hakam played an immense role. This is one of the biggest roles it played in communicating the Promised Messiah Islam's words, his dreams, his visions, his revelations that he was receiving from Allah the Almighty to all the Ahmadis around the world. Whoever was an Ahmadi, he was receiving this newspaper and had subscribed to it. Now, recalling the early days of Al-Hakam, if we take a look at what Hazrat Sheikh Sahib has said himself, Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib, he says that in August 1897, Henry Martin Clark brought about a lawsuit against the Promised Messiah. I recorded the minutes of this court case under the title Dusri Jang-e-Muqaddas, literally meaning the Second Holy War, which is named after Jang-e-Muqaddas, which was an account of a debate that took place between the Promised Messiah and the Christian clergy in Amritsar. So Hazrat Sheikh Sahib is narrating, this is before the time of Al-Hakam, a few months earlier in August 1897. He says, I strongly felt the need of a newspaper to express the viewpoint of the Jama'at and also to refute the allegations of political and religious nature that were brought about against the Jama'at. So Al-Hakam was launched in October 1897. The government was against the press in those days, and the present Press Act was about to be passed. But in these unfavorable circumstances, I launched the paper purely relying on Allah. At the end of 1897, Hazrat Sheikh Sahib says, at the end of 1897, a relaunch of the Baisa Akhbar was being considered, and I had accepted the offer of Munshi Mehboob Alam to be on the editorial staff. I was of the opinion that Al-Hakam should be based in Lahore, and based on this, I had joined the Baisa Akhbar. But when I attended the Jalsa Salana of Qadian in December 1897, a resolution was moved for the establishment of a madrasa, i.e. a school, for which I offered my services. Thus, destiny brought me to settle in Qadian. At the launch of Al-Hakam, discouraging factors like the decline in religious taste and the rise in opposition of Ahmadiyyat were brought to my attention, asserting that Al-Hakam would result in failure. The editor of Al-Hakam, he's referring to himself here, the editor of Al-Hakam came to Qadian in January 1898, sacrificing, for the sake of Qadian, the newfound ties with the Baisa Akhbar and other prospective benefits associated with Lahore. By the grace of Allah, I feel I have been prosperous. It was a great challenge to access a press in Qadian. There was no press, no designers and no copywriters, nor did any of these want to come and settle in Qadian. However, the editor, i.e. himself, Hazrat Sheikh Sahib, continued to handle these challenges. So you get a very good idea about the various challenges that Hazrat Sheikh Sahib endured at the time. He had none support, very little support at the time, in terms of finances, in terms of resources, in terms of manpower. And he did this all for the sake of his bai'at, which he had done to the Promised Messiah Islam. And this really goes to show what we should be doing in today's day and age. We have so many accessibility. We're blessed with so many opportunities. Sitting here right now, I'm speaking with a MacBook in front of me, which is an extremely expensive piece of equipment. And if Hazrat Sheikh Sahib had this opportunity in his time, I'm sure he would be probably making better use of this than I am right now as well. And for me, myself, this is a very, an opportunity for even me to reflect on what we should be doing. Bearing in mind the struggles that our forefathers, our elders faced in the early days, in the time of the Promised Messiah, only and purely for the sake of the Promised Messiah and the love that they had for him and the love that they had for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at and its message. Now, Al-Hakam would continue until around the 1920s, when I believe it was due to financial reasons. There could have been other reasons as well, like resources, like Hazrat Sheikh Sahib mentioned in this extract I just read out. And then it ceased to exist in the 1920s. But then again, in 1934, it was relaunched again in the time of Hazrat Muslim Maud, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad, may Allah be pleased with him, the second Khalifa of the Promised Messiah. And he published a special message regarding the second launch of Al-Hakam. And he says, Al-Hakam is the first ever newspaper of the Jama'at, and the service it has rendered, as well as Badr in the last years of the Promised Messiah, can never again be done by any newspaper, even in exchange of millions of rupees. I declare that whether Al-Hakam survives in its present form or not, its name will forever live on. No significant work on the Jama'at can be complete without its mention, as it carries the history of the Jama'at. Now, these were very powerful words which Hazrat Muslim Maud mentioned about, the status of Al-Hakam and how significant it is in the history of the Jama'at. In fact, the Promised Messiah Islam at one stage, I think this is a great summary of, what the status of Al-Hakam was in the early days and the efforts of Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib. The Promised Messiah once said, and I'll read out the Urdu, he says, Ye akhbar, that is Al-Hakam and Badr, Ye akhbar hamare do bazu hain. इल्हामात को फौरन मुल्कों में शाया करते हैं और गवाह बनते हैं. That is, these two newspapers, i.e. Al-Hakam and Badr, are my two arms. They immediately publish my revelations in different countries and become a witness to my truthfulness. Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib was, a very devoted companion to the Promised Messiah ﷺ. And some of you may have seen the picture of Hazrat Muslim Maud at the Wembley conference, where there's a group picture. It's in black and white. And in 1924, Hazrat Muslim Maud took a group picture with his companions at the time. And Hazrat Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib can be seen even then sitting on the floor, slightly towards the left side, where Hazrat Muslim Maud is seated. And so, he was someone who you could see his drive and his passion for the Jama'at. And that I think, as someone who works for Al-Hakam, and all of us who work for Al-Hakam, his example, and not only his, but the example of all these companions, including Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib, Hazrat Maulana Abdul Rahim Nayyar Sahib, Hazrat Maulana Abdul Rahim Dard Sahib, all of whom were great, stalwarts in their own capacity. They were incredible figures and incredible role models in terms of their service and utmost obedience to the Promised Messiah and Hazrat Khalifatul Masih the first and Hazrat Khalifatul Masih the second. That it really does push us, and it's a great driving force for us who work for Al-Hakam, and we only pray that more people like this, inshallah, are born in the future as well, and that Allah Ta'ala blesses the Jama'at with such individuals. Now, coming to the present age, we fast forward. So in 1934, it was launched, Al-Hakam, sorry, I'm jumping back again. In 1934, it was launched in the time of Hazrat Muslim Maud, and then in the 1940s, unfortunately, for one last time, it ceased to be published on a regular basis. Then you fast forward to 2018, in the time of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih V, may Allah strengthen his hand, and Al-Hakam is once again launched. And the need that was felt at the time, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih wanted for the youth of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at, especially those who live in the West, who are perhaps a little bit unfamiliar with the values of the Ahmadiyya Jama'at, with what we stand for, what exactly we are, what sort of a community we are, Are we a relief organization? Are we a charity organization? Or are we a group of men who are from God and to help the cause of the Promised Messiah, and effectively the cause of Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to reach the corners of the earth? So Hazur, bearing these things in mind, that the youth have a lot of confusions about their values and I guess their identity, Hazur wanted that this newspaper be launched, and so he commissioned us with this newspaper to reach the youth of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at, especially living in the West, and especially those who read in English, who understanding the English-speaking nations, because it has been felt that a lot of, it's a fact, most of the literature of the Jama'at is in Urdu, and a lot of the history of the Jama'at is in Urdu. And I'll give you an example of this. Recently, I also happened to work in the Archive and Research Department, which is a central department of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at. This was also recently launched in 2014 by Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis, may Allah strengthen his hand. And he, one professor was working with, so one of the jobs of this department is to effectively, of course, compile the archives of the Jama'at, the rich archives, so much we have, and to compile that in one place. There's a central place so that, we have a reference point as the Jama'at. But then one of the purposes of this department, the Archive and Research Department, is also to liaise with researchers working on the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at and its history and anything related to the Jama'at and its, its teachings, to liaise with them and to work with them. So one professor who was working on the history of the Jama'at in the United Kingdom, he was working with us for a few weeks, and he was with us in our office for a couple of weeks, and I had the good fortune to spend many hours with him, almost on a daily basis, from literally 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Relentlessly. We had a half an hour break, and he would permit me to go for namaz, but other than that, it was just relentless. And the only thing that I was helping him in was translating for him passages from Urdu, which he had gathered together while he was on his trip in Qadian and Rabwa, whilst researching on the Jama'at. And he came back, and then he brought these, big pile of papers, and he wanted me to go through them all with him, because he had them filtered by some, members of the Jama'at over there. Anyway, what we felt, especially, what I experienced myself, a personal experience, was that, this gentleman, he was so passionate in knowing about the history of the Jama'at, in so much so that he probably, I can say, even though I'm a Murrabi-e-Silsila, I'm someone who's graduated from Jamia Ahmadiyya, but I can say he probably knows more about the teachings of the Jama'at than I do, which again is a point to reflect, and that's something I'll come to a bit later on. But the second thing I learned was that these people, they struggle and toil so much just to fulfill a research paper, and they read, there were some researchers I know who purely learned the language of Urdu just so that they could read the books of the Promised Messiah firsthand and not have to rely on, translators. Most researchers effectively do rely on translators. So I was translating this for him, and I saw that he was struggling with this. Al-Hakam now is, in this day and age, providing a great way for historians to study the history of the Jama'at, in English. Of course, it's only been 2 years. And there's only so much that can be covered in 2 years. But the idea is, and as Hazur prayed when he launched the Al-Hakam newspaper English version in 2018, that may Allah enable this to continue. Now that it's been launched, may Allah enable this to continue and never see a cessation or a pause in publication. And this is something that we're working towards. And, in relentlessly, inshallah, we will continue. One point to remember, and this is something that we often get asked, is that, why should I read a newspaper? Why should I read this newspaper? And a newspaper, of course, I would agree with this question. And if a questioner ever came up to me and asked me this question, I would listen to them and hear what they had to say. And probably they would tell me, a newspaper is a bit of an outdated concept. We live in a very highly technological time. We live in a time where computers and servers have taken over, and screens are the new, thing to refer to. So why a newspaper? The fact is that the world has tried to go paperless. We've seen ebooks come and go, or they haven't really gone, but they're still there and they are popular. But the thing is, paper, the book form, can never disappear. It's very difficult for that to be taken away. The way that paper documents things, it's very difficult to document that in electronic form. So if any of you have been to the British Library, or you've seen newspaper archives, you'll know what I'm talking about. For example, you take a news website and you try and read its archives. Its archives can be changed at any point. And if you try and go back to read the narrative, for example, in the time of World War II, of Germany or another country, or Russia, or whatever, if it was all electronic, and it was merely websites that had documented articles and recorded them and preserved them, it would be very easy to interpolate them and disturb the originality of those articles or stories or whatever. But with paper, once it's printed, it's there, it's out there. You can't take it back, and that's one of the best things. Although it's a bit of a catch-22, but it's also at the same time a great way of documenting your history. Al-Hakam today is writing the history as we live it. For example, we have, from the Markaz. From the Markaz is a feature which, it says what it is basically. It's from the Markaz. It's what Hazrat Khalifatul Masih is, his regular engagements are in the Markaz. So you have various virtual mulaqats, you have the ijtimaat, his addresses at various events. We try to cover those in as much detail as possible. so that later on, when someone does want to come down the line, they know that, okay, there is at least one point, point of reference that they know will definitely have something written on what was said at the time, what the Khalifatul Masih at that time said. Then you have various things like, articles related to, just day-to-day life of what Ahmadis are getting up to. Sorry, before that, I should actually highlight the various news that we receive. We have correspondence from various parts of the world, and it's growing in number, and it's something, inshallah, which we will continue to grow and evolve in. But we have various correspondence, for example, in Finland, in Denmark, in Switzerland, in France, and everywhere. We try to have correspondents who can send us regular updates on the various activities and updates of the Jama'at, because we should never forget that the progress of today, no matter who is doing it, no matter what the name of a missionary may be, what the name of an Amir may be, what the name of a secretary tabligh of an area may be, everything that is being achieved in today's day and age is always going to be attributed to the time of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis, ayyadahullah ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz. And it's important for us to document each and every aspect of the achievements that we are experiencing in today's day and age, because this will effectively go on to serve as a credit to the Khilafat of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis, ayyadahullah ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz. And even today we see that people are now it's a way of prayers on behalf of the whole Jama'at. When you see so much activity happening from, in one paper, you see news from Niger, from, Africa, from South America, from Europe, from various parts of the world, from Asia. The Jama'at, when they read this, of course, there is, an element of prayer as well, where you feel happy, you feel reassured that, yes, our champions who are at the forefront and serving the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at, they're doing a wonderful job, and you want to pray that they do it even further. Then you have also various articles that readers of Al-Hakam will write. They'll share their views. You have letters to the editor, opinion pieces that anyone can share with us. And by the grace and blessings of Allah, I think lockdown played, the COVID lockdown played a great service for us. And this is something which Hazur actually mentioned in his special message, that readers of Al-Hakam are actually, writing articles about what they're doing in their lockdown and what they're doing in their spare time, because let's not forget, lockdown was a very difficult period for all of us, and we all had various challenges. But I think what one faith-inspiring aspect of the lockdown was, and this is exactly what Hazur referred to, was that it was actually bringing people a lot more closer to God, because they had a lot of spare time on their hand. They had a lot more time to give to God Almighty. And of course, in a fast-paced lifestyle, in a fast-paced world, especially when you're talking about, the West and the lifestyle that we live here, it is very fast-paced, and it can be very easy to neglect our dues to God Almighty. But I think lockdown was a big, slap in the right direction, a kick in the right direction, that, this is what your priority should be. And I think we all realized that, okay, we need to be focusing more on prayers and our dues to God Almighty. So, this is something which was of great service in the time of lockdown. And even after that, I think that played a great service, because Al-Hakam found and discovered many great writers. Students of Jamia started writing. We had family members, husbands, wives, children, writing articles and sending it to us. And then one other key aspect of Al-Hakam is the Friday sermon that is getting published on a weekly basis of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih. So, of course, we have the Friday sermons which are shown on MTA, and that is something we should all watch. If not multiple occasions, and at least once, we should listen to those live. But what we have in Al-Hakam, and what we try to present, is what we are presenting is the official translation of Hazur's Friday sermon, which is done in collaboration with the Review of Religions team. And that is being published on a weekly basis. And, because I have the good fortune of working in Al-Hakam, and I get to proofread the entire newspaper on a weekly basis, and there's so much to read. But the Friday sermon, when you do read it back, it's a completely different experience. You pick up a lot of the points that you may have missed whilst listening to the Friday sermon. So, a lot of us like to take notes of the Friday sermon, and this is a great way to help in those notes. like I said, it's an official translation, so it's something that has been approved by the official translating team in the Review of Religions side, and it's something that we have the good fortune to publish on our pages. So this is something which I feel it doesn't get enough attention, and I think this is something that we should all perhaps later on promote to other members of the Jama'at who are English speaking, that if you ever do wish to go and read the Friday sermon, the actual text, not the summary, the actual text, from A to Z, you can read it in Al-Hakam, and it's published a month after, because there are translation does require a bit of time, so it's published a month after, but that is also included in Al-Hakam. Now, coming back to the question, if someone was to ask me why read this newspaper, yes, it's a newspaper. Yes, we live in a time where it's very difficult to pick up something and read it. We live in a very fast-paced environment. If you personally ask me, as an editor, you would probably expect me to say, yes, you should read Al-Hakam, you should read every single page, you should read it all the time, and you should read nothing else. That's what anyone else would tell you who belongs to the outside world. But knowing what I know, from the training that I've received through Jama'at-e-Ahmadiyya and the blessings of Jama'at-e-Ahmadiyya, I've realized that, of course, it's a very challenging task. And when we ask people to pick up a book or pick up a piece of paper, especially in today's day and age, before perhaps it wasn't such a big issue. But now it's a very challenging task to ask the new generation to pick up a newspaper and read it. But I would say, give it a try. The thing is, Al-Hakam is being published on a weekly basis. I remember growing up, I was never the most studious of students. I wasn't a great avid reader. I wasn't a bookworm, and I have some relatives who are like that, and I do envy them, because I wish I had that patience to sit down and want to read a book. Of course, I do have to force myself. There are a lot of things I have to tell myself before I pick up a book and read it. It's a very difficult and challenging task, and you're probably wondering what an editor's doing. What sort of an editor are you who has such inclinations? And if you ask me, if I was to ask or inquire about a certain matter taking place in the world, the easiest thing for me to do would be to perhaps watch a documentary on it and get a summary of it, a gist of what's being said in a matter of 30 minutes or 20 minutes. But the fact is that what you get from reading and what you get from paper is not what you can get from other means and mediums. Al-Hakam is something that's being published every week. And I remember Hazrat Khalifatul Masih once said, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis, that he even said to Jamia students that you should be reading these newspapers like Al-Fazl. At the time, there was just Al-Fazl at the time in Urdu. And he said that even if you're not reading the entire Al-Fazl, you should at least be reading, or if you're not reading the books of the Promised Messiah, you should at least be reading the extracts of the writings of the Promised Messiah that are included on the front page. Or you should be reading various other things that highlight the teachings of Islam and the teachings of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at. So even I, as a youngster, like I said, I wasn't a great student, but what I would do is I would pick up a magazine or a book of the Jama'at and just read through, the blurb perhaps, or just the various subheadings. Or in this case, if we're talking about Al-Hakam, read the various headings that have been included in this week's, issue. It gives you a good understanding of what's going on in the Ahmadiyya world and what's being said, and also what sort of articles are being written. And it gives you a good understanding of what we as Ahmadi Muslims stand for. One great thing, I think, let me come to one thing about, identity. Identity is a big challenge today, and it's one of those challenges which all of us are struggling with, especially living in the West. But generally, I think this goes, globally. This transcends any country or any borders. The biggest struggle is identity. We're struggling with a purpose, for a purpose. And Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis, Ayyadahullah ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz, may Allah strengthen his hand, has touched on this time and again, that we need to realize what we're here for. And of course, in a nutshell, we're here to worship Allah the Almighty. We have two rights, the Huququllah and Huququl Ibad, which are the rights that we owe to Allah and the rights that we owe to our creation. As Ahmadi Muslims, we should effectively have an easier job than others to understand our values, because we're offered so much, in the form of ijtimas, in the form of atfal or khudam classes or nasirat and lajna classes. We have meetings, we always are knocking our heads together in a good way. And, we're meeting each other, we're coming across one another, we're, learning from one another. Al-Hakam just adds to those. And of course, we have MTA, where, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih is in a way, he's always in our homes. He's always there, he's accessible. We can switch on the television and we can listen to his words and benefit from his words and his advice. there was a time when people used to, were thirsty for this, but we have it so easy, we have it so accessible. As Ahmadi Muslims, if we are struggling with identity, we should definitely take the time to read up on our history, read up on who the promised Messiah ﷺ was, read up about his beautiful personality, what sort of a person he was. What sort of a person is Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, whose bayt we have done and who we have pledged to sacrifice our life, wealth, time and honor for? Who were these people? Who were these tremendous, exemplary people? Who was the Holy Prophet of Islam, Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Reading will be the only way that we can learn. We can be told and narrated various instances, but until we don't own it for ourselves, and we can be told various things. I can sit here and tell you so many different things, but until you don't go and research for yourself, you won't own it. As I remember Hazrat Hazur once in a class told us while we were sitting there that Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, he asked, how many of you read the newspaper? And he asked some of us, and we put our hands up, and one Waqfino, he said that I read the Metro newspaper, and that's basically a free newspaper that you can find on the subway. And Hazur said, no, you shouldn't be reading such free newspapers. You should be purchasing newspapers yourself so that you own it. He said that Hazrat Khalifatul Masih III said that when you purchase a book or a newspaper for yourself, then you effectively own that information. That becomes your right, that becomes your property. And in a similar manner, in a similar vein, when you research and you inquire about what the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat stands for, it will become yours. It will be, you will own that. That will become your possession. Coming to the point now, Al-Hakam is a way to provide you with a sense of identity. So let me give you one example, type of, a good example of what sort of instance, what sort of incidents we include in Al-Hakam. We have, a segment called 100 Years Ago. And in 100 years ago, it speaks for itself, really. We go back 100 years ago. So if today, on the 19th of October, 2021, we're talking about today, we go back to 19th of October, 1921, and we see what was happening then. So off the top of my head, right now what's happening in 1921, I've read it so much, I actually feel like I'm living in that period of time sometimes, because I'm proofreading it so much and I'm reading through these articles so much that I sometimes feel that as if I'm living there. So in 1921, where we've just seen Hazrat Muslim Maud return from Kashmir for a short trip for his health and for his good health. And so he returns, and only a few days ago, what happens is, Hazrat Muslim Maud is seated with some Ahmadi friends, and some Ahmadi friends are posing questions to Hazrat Muslim Maud, and they're asking him about various, things, and Hazrat Muslim Maud is explaining those things to him, to those gentlemen. And that has been, that has just come in last week's, in the last issue of Al-Hakam. And in a similar manner, in recent weeks, we've seen in 1921, when we talk about 100 years ago, we've seen Hazrat Mufti Sahib have great success in his tabligh endeavors in the United States of America, as he had just arrived in the United States only a few months earlier. And Hazrat Mufti Sahib is, I believe, in Detroit at the moment, if we go back 100 years ago. And then similarly, Hazrat Maulvi Abdur Rahim Nayyar Sahib, Hazrat Master Abdur Rahim Nayyar Sahib is in Africa, in West Africa, and he's had tremendous success. Around 4,000 people in one instance accepted the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat at the hand of, or through a chief who encouraged his followers to accept the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, because, well, he explained to them what exactly it is, and they all accepted. So, this is just an idea of what we're experiencing. Now, one instance I wish to relate to you is, and this is something which especially the UK listeners will be able to relate to. You'll understand why, not just the UK listeners, but anyone who's listening from around the world. Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib had just arrived in the United Kingdom. I believe this is around 1919 or 1918. I mean, around that period. And while in London, he was based in central London, he found out that there was going to be an event that would take place in the main city of London, central London. And this would have incredibly, influential people, including Winston Churchill, who at the time was the, I was meant to search for this term. I must admit, I apologize. I don't know exactly the term. So I'm going to use a term which, I mean, he was responsible for World War I. I wasn't responsible for World War I, but he was the man in charge, if you like. The actual term is slipping me. I do apologize. But anyway, in 1918, as we know, World War I had just ended. Around that period, World War I had just ended, and so this was a sort of celebratory event that was taking place in central London. And Hazrat Mufti Sahib found out about it, that there were going to be key individuals there. Hazrat Mufti Sahib, with his passion and his drive for tabligh, he turned up at this venue, and he's outside the main door, and the doorman, the very first doorman, he gets stopped by him, and the doorman says, where are you going? Do you have a ticket? And Hazrat Mufti Sahib, he's dressed in his customary green turban and his incredible kurta and shalwar kameez, and he's dressed very elegantly. And he says, no, I don't have a ticket. But this doorman, he realizes that this gentleman doesn't seem like he's from around here. So he assumes that, okay, he must be a delegate. So, who am I to stop him? So he allows him to go in. He says, okay, please, you may come in. Hazrat Mufti Sahib enters the venue. There are many people seated there, and they've all gathered together. And the time for the speech is about to start. The time for the event is about to start. And another gentleman who's an organizer, he approaches Hazrat Mufti Sahib, who sees him and notices him standing around, and he's not taking his seat. And he says, do you know where you're seated? And he said, well, I don't have a ticket. And this gentleman, he realizes it's already too late to send him out. So he just says, okay, you know what? There's a seat right there. Why don't you go and take a seat there? And the seat that he's pointed towards is a very, it's a seat that is not very hidden away. It's very prominent. It's at the front. Okay, yes. So we've been told in 1920 as Secretary of State for War and Air. That is what Jazakallah Nadeem Sahib. So that is what Winston Churchill was serving as at the time. Anyway, Hazrat Mufti Sahib is then taken towards this seat where he's very prominent. He's sitting at the very front. And he is then, he's seated there. He's seated with, he describes this later on. He says, I'm sitting with various, viscounts and various representatives and various ambassadors. But Hazrat Mufti, one of the most amazing things I learned from this is that Hazrat Mufti Sahib was not in any sort of complex. He didn't seem out of his place. He was there as a representative of the promised Messiah. With this in mind, forget any complex. He felt even more superior in a good way, in a very humbling way. But he felt more superior than them. He didn't feel like he was anywhere near inferior than these people. Otherwise, he wouldn't have turned up with such confidence. Winston Churchill now takes to the stage, and he's thanking all these various people from different countries who supported England in the war. And knowing Winston Churchill, he was a great orator, and he had the crowd wrapped around his little finger, and he's really roaring them. He has the crowd roaring and clapping, and he's mentioning various countries who gave support to England, but he misses out India. And Hazrat Mufti Sahib, in his immense passion, he stands up and says, and India, that you had India's support too. Winston Churchill turns around, he looks at Mufti Sahib, and he turns back to the crowd and says, and India too. And with this, there is a lot of laughter, and there is a lot of, joy in the crowd when they hear Mufti Sahib's contribution to Winston Churchill's speech. In fact, I do have a picture of this if you wish to see it. Let me just see. Is it possible to share my screen? Sorry, I should have asked this earlier.
Yes, you can, Murrabi Sahib. If you just click on the share option.
Share screen. Okay, here we go. Right. Okay.
Yes, I think so.
Is it showing up? Okay. So can you see the image in front of you right now?
Not at the moment. No.
Not at the moment. Okay. Sorry. Let me just. How about no? You can't see it now.
No, if you just close that window.
I see. Okay, I think maybe
I'll remove it for now, and then if you want to try again.
How about now? Okay. Nonetheless, what I can do is, I can give you the date. The date is, this was published in Al-Hakam on the 19th of October, I believe, 19th of October, 2018. And you can go to see this. It was in the 100 Years Ago section on Al-Hakam. And the picture is there. There's a picture of Winston Churchill who's just given a speech to the crowd. And you can notice Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib, Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib, in the crowd towards, well, we've given a caption and you can see for yourself, you know, and so you know the story about this incident. But this is just one example. This is just one example of what sort of incidents you can expect to be included in Al-Hakam. And it just goes to show how, you know, not just Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib, but later on, I mean, if we're talking about 100 years ago, I know that inshallah in the coming few years, there are going to be so many new characters whose noble example we will see and which we can learn from. These were companions, these were devout servants of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at, and who didn't falter in their faith. You know, they didn't stumble at any stage. They were entirely confident in their belief and in their conviction, in their identity. And identity is something that I wish to highlight here, that we sometimes, living in the West, we can perhaps, you know, if we're of Pakistani origin, then we can, you know, sometimes feel like maybe perhaps we don't belong here, and then we don't belong in Pakistan. And then knowing that the state of Pakistan is, you know, that we as Ahmadi Muslims are not permitted there. So we feel as if, you know, we don't belong anywhere. But the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, I believe, gives us one of the strongest identities, in that we, you know, have been given a very superior, a very superior motive, a superior objective, by accepting Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam, by accepting Khilafat Ahmadiyya. We have before us such role models who have exemplified, you know, the highest peaks, the apex of obedience, like Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sahib, like Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Rahim Nayyar Sahib. We should also try to live up to that. And I believe that Al-Hakam is one of those ways that can educate us exactly what sort of Ahmadis we should be living in today's day and age. You know, we had recently a documentary that was shown on the lives of Abid Khan Sahib, his parents, who is the press and media secretary of the Jama'at. And I think that also was a great example of how we, living in the West, we should, you know, live our lives. How, what sort of identity we should take for ourselves. So, in a nutshell, this is, I think, something that we should definitely take away with us. And I think Al-Hakam, inshallah, you know, if we talk about where do you see Al-Hakam in the future, I think Al-Hakam, inshallah, it will always have a place, because not only is it something that has the prayers of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam and the members of the, you know, devout members of the Jama'at. It's also something that, you know, today Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis Ayyadullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz does wish for the youngsters of the Jama'at, especially those who are English speaking, living in the West, to seek benefit from. Al-Hakam is a newspaper, like I said, it's a weekly newspaper. It's published every Friday, and it's primarily targeted at the Ahmadi readership. And a lot of the jargon, a lot of the terms you will read, we haven't translated it for that very sake, because, you know, there is the Ahmadi jargon and terminology, and we feel that that jargon is strong enough to you know, withstand itself. And so we feel that a lot of the terms, they don't need to be translated because they're strong in themselves. And so, you know, when the Ahmadi reader does pick up the newspaper, he won't feel like it's foreign to him. He will feel like it's, you know, his own words, effectively. So Al-Hakam, inshallah, in the future, what we hope is, in our prayer is, you know, it does continue, like Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis Ayyadullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz prayed, and we hope and pray that it does play a role in molding the collective psyche. You know, newspapers play a role in molding the collective psyche of a nation. Every newspaper plays this role, whether you talk about The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, New York Times, what have you. All these newspapers, they portray and they mold the collective psyche of a nation. Al-Hakam, we have hope and pray that it also molds, and, you know, through its education, through the teachings of the Jama'at, through the teachings of Islam, it's able to impart the wisdom of Islam, the wisdom of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jama'at's teachings, and Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salam's teachings to the youngsters, especially living in the West, but around the world. And it's my prayer, may Allah Ta'ala enable this to happen, may Allah Ta'ala enable Al-Hakam to serve its purpose, and even beyond that. Ameen. Jazakumullah.
Muin, Jazakumullah, Murrabi Sahib. Just whilst we have time, I would like to get through as many questions as possible that viewers have sent through during the lecture tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pair up some of these questions just in the interest of time. So we have one question. Firstly, why was the newspaper named Al-Hakam? And also, are the original Al-Hakams available? And what about their translation?
Right. So why was it named Al-Hakam? Al-Hakam, of course, that's actually a very good question. Why didn't we choose an English name, as opposed to an Arabic name? Like I said, Al-Hakam has a very important role in the history of the Jama'at. It served a great purpose, like I said at the outset. And I think that speaks for itself as well. But also, we feel that sometimes, there are, like I said, certain terms of the Jama'at have become so common. Al-Hakam, the name is it's actually an attribute of God Almighty, but it was also a description given to the promised Messiah والسلام, as the judge, that he would judge, he would differentiate between right and wrong, he would distinguish between right and wrong, and as the judge, as the Hakam, this would be one of his roles. And so Al-Hakam, we felt that rather than having it just as the English, which just as the judge, perhaps Al-Hakam in itself, with the Ahmadi readership in mind, it would be more familiar, and it would probably, we felt that it would be a lot more hard-hitting as a name, rather than an English name like, the Light or the Judge. But then again, there's no hard and fast rule, but this is the name which effectively then later on Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen graciously approved as well. And sorry, the second question,
yes, Murrabi-e-Silsila. So the other question was, are the original Al-Hakams available, and have they been translated at all?
The original Al-Hakams, in fact, it's funny you should mention that. While preparing for today, I was just looking through some old, we have it in the archives. We have the very first, issues of Al-Hakam from 1897. So, and this was on display at Jalsa Salana, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago. We had this on display, the very first Al-Hakam on display. So yes, those are available in both physical form and in electronic form. Those haven't been fully accessible to the public just as of yet, but it's something that we're working on, and inshallah, in times to come, hopefully we will be able to provide that.
So a couple of other questions. I think one of them you already answered. One question was, can members write for Al-Hakam? I think you've already mentioned that.
Yeah. So you can feel free to contribute by writing to us at info@alhakam.org, info@alhakam.org, and you can send us any contribution you have, whether it's in the form of an opinion piece, any you feel like maybe perhaps there's been an extremely worthy of mentioning achievement by someone but yeah, anyone can contribute, and then our editors will then pick up those contributions and then filter through them and see what we can take as contributions to the newspaper. And if you wish to subscribe, I should also mention you can subscribe by emailing us at subscribing to the print copy. I should have mentioned that in the speech, actually. You can actually subscribe to the print copy by emailing us at subscribe@alhakam.org. Yeah.
So I'll type that into the chat as well. Sorry, another couple of questions as well. This is more in relation to Hazrat Ayyadullah bin Aziz's personal involvement with the publication. Firstly, the question is, you always release articles very quickly after Hazur has delivered a speech or conducted a session.
Yeah.
How do you manage to do that so quickly? That's one question. And the second question, you must have some memorable moments being close to Hazur Anwar, Ayyadullah bin Aziz. And is anything in particular that you'd like to share about any such experiences?
Right. So, no, alhamdulillah, our team is very, by the grace and blessings of Allah, only the grace and blessings of Allah, they're trained to type very fast and, follow the address very quickly. And, we, as a news, effectively, Al-Hakam is also a news organization, if you like. And, we do like to get our news out as quickly as possible. And we believe that news should get out there before it becomes, too, not necessarily outdated, but, before, people start forgetting about it, or there's other ways to listen to the address. And we try to give that so that, if someone immediately requires a point of reference, they can quickly refer to it. So, we have designated team members who are allocated these addresses to summarize. Yeah, that's probably the answer to that. And then as for incidents, I think one thing that does come to mind is that any mulaqat I have had the opportunity to meet Hazur in and seek advice with respect to Al-Hakam, I've always noticed that Hazur has been a big proponent of freedom of press. And when I say this, I mean that he has always said that you're the editor, you can do as you like. And this is his loving way of saying this. But of course, what I know he does wish for us is to research ourselves on what a particular issue is, or what the answer to a particular issue is. And this isn't just Al-Hakam, but even before this, Hazur always expected us as Jamia students, or even as Murrabi-e missionaries, to find the answers for ourselves and not just blindly go and ask for Hazur's advice all the time. It's good, of course. We need approvals, and we need guidance as Al-Hakam, and we do tend to always want to seek guidance from Hazur with respect to what we're including in Al-Hakam, and this is something we continue to do and will inshallah continue to do. But Hazur is always has always encouraged us that you're the editor, so you can do as you like. And it's a very loving way of Hazur promoting freedom of press, and I think Hazur feels that this is a newspaper and it should be functioning as a newspaper as well. So he wants for us to work as a newspaper, but at the same time, of course, we always need our spiritual guide, and Hazrat Khalifah Masih is always there by the grace and blessings of Allah to provide guidance on various issues, and we're blessed to have him in this respect. And I think that is something that I do feel that we're very privileged in respect to our work in Al-Hakam.
Mashallah. With your permission, Rabbi Sab, another couple of questions.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So one question in relation to what you've just mentioned about you have that sort of freedom as editor to choose whatever content you'd like to include in the Al-Hakam. So if you could maybe tell us more about the process and how you decide what goes into a weekly edition. And also secondly, another question, is there a specific team that translates historic articles?
So yes, we do have a certain team that is allocated for translations. What we tend to do is we do shuffle around so that any one person is not getting stale in one department. So what we try and do is we try and shuffle responsibilities around just to keep things going. So with respect to translation, yes, we do have one team, and then we'll also try out, if we're having 3 or 4 people working on one translation, then we'll have another one person working on it at the same time, and so that we can quickly, change over responsibilities and try different things, so that we're polishing up our skills in that respect of all departments and areas. With respect to your the first question, which was it related to. Sorry,
that's okay. How do you decide on the content in a weekly edition?
Right. Okay. So what we have some content which is predetermined in a way. Like, for example, we have 100 years ago, and we have this week in history. We have a team that's designated to research as well. So they provide these, dates and stuff with respect to this week in history. Any incident that may have taken place in this week, in any date, any year, 1956 or 1987, and different years on that specific date. They provide that. We have that ready. And then what we also have is a team dedicated to translating that and making that available. And then what we do is we have a few days before the final submission date of the newspaper. And in those final days, we're just polishing, the articles, we're proofreading them. And then on the final day, what we do is collectively, we all get together, we proofread the newspaper from A to Z. And then anything that was missing or on behalf of our proofreaders' efforts, then that those edits are made. But as regards the articles, we have, alhamdulillah, it is a big blessing that anytime Hazur has mentioned Al-Hakam, I have seen, I think this also answers one of the earlier questions with respect to Hazur's involvement in Al-Hakam. I think one of the biggest involvements is that Hazur, whenever he's mentioned the name of Al-Hakam, any point, we've noticed and experienced such a boom, a spike in the traffic that we have on our website. And not only that, we have also witnessed an expansion in our contributors, people writing for Al-Hakam, writers basically. And this has been such an overwhelming experience that we've never really had to think about, oh my goodness, we don't have enough content for the next issue. By the grace and blessings of Allah, we have so much content that but it doesn't mean that the listeners today should feel like, okay, we don't need to send our articles here. No, do send your articles, because they're always welcome here. This is effectively your platform. Al-Hakam is a newspaper. It's your newspaper as Ahmadi Muslims. You all own it as much as any of us own it, and we're all a part of this. We're all in this together. It's a collective struggle against not only illiteracy, but also against the irreligiousness and the growing tide and rise of irreligiousness in today's day and age. And we all must do our part in contributing towards, spreading the message of the truth of religion. And no, alhamdulillah, we have a great number of writers around the world, in Ghana, in Pakistan, in Germany, and so many different areas of the world, so many countries in Africa, in Asia, that alhamdulillah, we are blessed in that respect. And I request prayers on behalf of Al-Hakam to all the listeners as well, to remember us all in the prayers as well, that we can continue to work in this manner, even better manner, inshallah, in the future as well, so that we can serve the Jama'at in the best possible manner.
I think Murrabi Sahib, you've given a wonderful insight into what goes on behind the scenes with the Al-Hakam newspaper, and the great blessing of being involved, and mashallah, the direct guidance and prayers obviously you receive from Hazrat Das, Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasir Aziz. Just one comment I wanted to share from a viewer, Mariam Khan Sahib, who says that Al-Hakam is a gem and we all thoroughly enjoy it. Jama'at history is not so easily available elsewhere. I would recommend adding a search option also to the app. If I can also just add in also, and encourage viewers to really subscribe to the paper version. So this is something I look forward to receiving every week, just one of the most recent editions here. And there's such a vast array of articles that you'll find in the Al-Hakam. So obviously it will cover spiritual matters, the guidance of Hazrat Das, matters of jurisprudence. And also I think one of the most recent editions, there was an interesting article about an Ahmadi being the first to bowl for the Pakistan cricket team. It was quite an interesting story in Nasir Malik. So from spirituality to sport, I think there's a whole range of interesting articles there. But mashallah, you're doing a grand job, and may Allah Ta'ala bless you all with the great service that you're rendering. And may Allah Ta'ala take Al-Hakam from strength to strength. Ameen.
Ameen.
So just to remind our viewers that our lectures, inshallah, will return next week. So we will have our next Urdu lecture next Monday. That will be delivered by Murrabi-e-Silsila Fazlur Rahman Sahib on the topic of prophecies of prophets and the understanding. So that will be at 7 o'clock next Monday, the 25th of October. And then a week today, we'll have our next English lecture delivered by Secretary of the UK, Nisar Orchard Sahib, on the topic of worship. So please join us for both of those lectures at the same time of 7 o'clock next week. If I could please request Murrabi Sahib to lead us in silent prayer.
Please join me in silent prayer. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakumullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.